The air in the imperial bedchamber was thick with the scent of rose oil and powdered malachite. It clung to the silk tapestries, the gilded furniture, and the skin of the boy who sat before a silver mirror. He was not yet 18, but his eyes, lined heavily with black coal, held a weariness that belied his years. One hand, fingers stained with pigment, trembled slightly as he applied a touch of carmine to his lips, puckering them to see the effect. He was not preparing for a meeting with the Senate or a review of the legions. He was preparing for a lover. For him, this was the truer act of power. How had it come to this? How had a boy priest from the sun-scorched lands of Syria, a worshipper of a strange black stone, come to sit on the throne of Augustus and command the known world? And more pressingly, why did that world, which had seen madmen, tyrants, and fools wear the imperial purple, now whisper with a unique and venomous hatred that this boy, Varius Avitus Bassianus, known to the world as Elagabalus, was the most depraved of them all? He tilted his head, the jewels in his wig catching the lamplight like captured stars. In the reflection, he saw not just an emperor, but a vessel. The world saw a boy playing dress-up, a perversion of Roman masculinity. But he saw a divine reflection. He was the bride of his God, and on earth he would be the bride of the men he chose. The senators, with their stern frowns and rigid virtues, could not comprehend it. They saw sin where he saw sacrament, madness where he saw devotion. They saw a boy who delighted in the feel of a man's rough hands on his silken robes, who paid fortunes for a handsome face, who sought to make a charioteer his Caesar. They saw the end of Rome. He saw a new beginning, painted in the vibrant, shocking colors of his own desires. This is the story of that boy. It is not a simple tale of debauchery, for nothing about him was simple. It is the story of a collision between East and West, between an ancient, ecstatic faith and the unyielding gravity of Roman tradition. It is the story of his strange and scandalous loves, of the men he elevated and the empire he alienated. This is the story of Elagabalus, the Emperor of the Sun, and the carnal pleasures that led to his spectacular, brutal downfall. He saw a new beginning, painted in the vibrant, shocking colors of his own desires. This is the story of that boy. It is not a simple tale of debauchery, for nothing about him was simple. It is the story of a collision between East and West, between an ancient, ecstatic faith and the unyielding gravity of Roman tradition. It is the story of his strange and scandalous loves, of the men he elevated and the empire he alienated. This is the story of Elagabalus, the Emperor of the Sun, and the carnal pleasures that led to his spectacular, brutal downfall. The world of Varius Avitus Bassianus was not one of cold marble and colder politics. It was a world of sun, sand, and stone. Born and raised in Emesa, a wealthy city in the Roman province of Syria, his childhood was steeped in a religious fervor that was alien to the pragmatic sensibilities of Rome. He was not the grandson of a senator, but the hereditary high priest of the sun god Elagabalus. His days were a rhythm of ritual. He would wake before dawn, his small body draped in robes of the finest purple and gold silk, his face yet unpainted. He would walk barefoot across the cool flagstones of the great temple, the air already humming with the chants of the lesser priests. At the heart of the sanctuary, in a place of supreme honor, lay his god. It was not a statue carved in the likeness of a man, like the familiar Roman Jupiter or Mars. It was a great, conical black stone, a beetle believed to have fallen from the heavens. To Varius, it was the purest manifestation of the divine, unshaped by human hands, a direct gift from the cosmos. He would dance before the stone. The music was a wild cacophony of pipes, drums, and cymbals, a stark contrast to the stately hymns of Roman temples. His movements were ecstatic, unrestrained, a spiraling trance that sought to unite him with the fiery heart of the sun. He would feel the god's power coursing through him, a searing heat that was both terrifying and intoxicating. In those moments, he was not a boy. He was a conduit, a living bridge between the mortal world and the celestial fire. His mother, Julia Maesa, watched these displays with a mixture of pride and adoration. She saw in her son the divine spark, a destiny far greater than that of a provincial priest. She was the daughter of Julia Maesa, a woman of formidable ambition and political cunning, the sister of the former Empress Julia Domna and sister-in-law to the late Emperor Septimius Severus. The blood of emperors ran in their veins, and Maesa never let her daughters forget it. When the tyrannical Emperor Caracalla was assassinated, and the throne was usurped by his Praetorian prefect, Macrinus, Julia Maesa saw her chance. From her effective exile in Emesa, she began to spin a web of immense ambition. Macrinus was a commoner, an equestrian who had clawed his way to the top. He had no imperial lineage, no divine right. Maesa had a grandson who, she claimed, had both. The lie she crafted was as brilliant as it was audacious. She started a rumor, carefully seeded among the discontented legions stationed near Emesa, that her grandson Varius was not the son of his purported father. He was, she whispered, the illegitimate son of the beloved and recently murdered Caracalla. He was a Severan, the last male heir of a dynasty the soldiers remembered with fondness and loyalty. To the soldiers, weary of the parsimonious and unimpressive Macrinus, the story was intoxicating. They looked at the beautiful, charismatic boy priest, with his exotic allure and his supposed imperial blood, and they saw a savior. Gold from Maesa's vast fortune sealed their loyalty. Varius, barely 14 years old, was swept up in the whirlwind. One night, he was spirited away from the temple and presented to the 3rd Gallic Legion. By torchlight, they hailed him as Caesar, dressing his slight frame in the imperial purple. His name was changed. He was no longer Varius Avitus Bassianus. He was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, a name deliberately chosen to evoke the golden age of the Antonine dynasty, and his supposed father, Caracalla, whose official name was also Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. The boy who had only ever commanded priests now commanded an army. The transition was dizzying. His grandmother Maesa and his mother Soemias were the true strategists, guiding the rebellion, but it was his face, his name, and his divine connection that served as its banner. The decisive battle against Macrinus came near Antioch. The boy emperor, dressed in his priestly robes, was present on the field. When his troops began to falter, it was Maesa and Soemias who rode into the fray, shaming the men, rallying them to fight for the boy they had sworn to protect. They won. Macrinus fled and was soon captured and executed. A message was dispatched to the Senate in Rome. It announced the victory and the accession of the new emperor. The senators, thousands of miles away, were presented with a fait accompli. They had little choice but to ratify the army's choice. But they also received a portrait of their new ruler. It was not the image of a stern military Roman. It was a painting of a priest in his exotic finery, standing beside his black stone. A collective shudder went through the hallowed halls of the Curia. They had accepted a boy as their emperor. They did not yet know they had also accepted his god. For Elagabalus, as he was now mockingly beginning to be called by his detractors after his god, the victory was not a political one. It was a divine mandate. His god, Elagabal, had conquered the god of Macrinus. Now it was time to take his rightful place at the center of the universe, Rome. The journey west was slow, a grand procession of indulgence. The imperial court wintered in Bithynia, and it was there that the first true cracks began to appear between the expectations of a Roman emperor and the reality of the Syrian priest. He paid little attention to the tedious matters of administration, leaving them to his grandmother. His days were consumed with religious rites and the exploration of new, intoxicating freedoms. He began to surround himself with a court that valued beauty and charm over experience and virtue. He scandalized the traditionalists by appointing a dancer to command the Praetorian Guard and a barber to oversee the vital grain supply. But these were minor tremors compared to the earthquake to come. His primary goal, the singular obsession that drove him, was to bring his god to Rome and establish Elagabal as the supreme deity of the Roman Empire. The black stone, his silent, powerful companion, was carefully loaded onto a ship. It was sailing towards the heart of the world, and in its shadow traveled the boy who believed its power was his own, ready to remake the eternal city in his own image. Rome, the city of law, order, and tradition, was waiting. It had no idea what was about to hit it. The arrival of Elagabalus in Rome in the late summer of 219 AD was a spectacle of calculated provocation. The city was accustomed to triumphal entries, generals returning with captives and spoils, emperors celebrating victories on the frontier. They were prepared for pomp, but not for this kind of pageantry. Elagabalus entered the city not in the traditional toga of a statesman or the armor of a general, but in his flowing, jewel-encrusted silk robes of an Eastern priest. His face was painted, his eyes dark and alluring, a style more suited to a courtesan than a princeps. The senators and aristocrats who lined the Sacra Via looked on in stunned silence. This was not the masculine, martial ideal of an emperor. This was something else entirely, something foreign and, to their eyes, unervingly effeminate. But the boy was merely the herald. The true focus of the procession was the god itself. The black stone of Maesa, Elagabalus, was mounted on a chariot adorned with gold and gems, drawn by 6 magnificent white horses. Elagabalus himself walked backwards before the chariot, his eyes fixed on the stone, his hands scattering incense and flower petals. He held the reins, ensuring no mortal would sit above his god. To him, this was an act of supreme piety. To the Romans, it was an act of supreme absurdity. An emperor, the master of the world, acting as a stable hand for a rock. The initial shock soon hardened into a deep-seated resentment. Elagabalus, blissfully unaware or simply uncaring of the offense he was causing, immediately set about his great project, the religious revolution. He built a magnificent temple on the Palatine Hill, the traditional home of Rome's elite, to house his god. This temple, the Elagabalium, was to be the new religious center of the empire. His plan was not merely to add Elagabalus to the crowded Roman pantheon. It was to subordinate all other gods to him. In a move of breathtaking sacrilege, he ordered the most sacred relics of Roman religion to be transferred to the Elagabalium to serve his stone. The eternal fire of Vesta, the Palladium, the shields of the Salii, the very anchors of Roman spiritual identity, were to be moved from their ancient sanctuaries to become mere attendants to this foreign deity. He declared that no god could be worshipped in Rome unless it was in concert with Elagabalus. He tried to explain it to the grim-faced senators he summoned. "He is the master of all," he would say, his voice filled with a genuine, almost pleading passion. "Jupiter, Juno, all of your gods, they are merely servants, aspects of the one true power, the sun invincible." They did not understand. They saw a blasphemous child tearing at the very foundations of the Pax Deorum, the peace between gods and men that had guaranteed Rome's success for 1,000 years. When they resisted, he did not rage like a tyrant. He simply bypassed them, using his imperial power to enact his will. He forced the highest senators and equestrians to participate in his rites, to dance and chant around the black stone as he did. The sight of gray-haired, dignified consuls, men who had governed provinces and led armies, being made to caper and whirl like Syrian dervishes was a humiliation they would never forgive. His personal life became a direct extension of his religious heresies. Roman tradition, while tolerant of homosexual dalliances, was rigid about roles. A Roman man of status could take a male lover, but he must always be the dominant, masculine partner. To be penetrated was to be feminized, to surrender one's virtus, manly virtue, the very quality that entitled a Roman to rule. Elagabalus shattered this taboo with gleeful abandon. He not only took male lovers, but he reveled in playing the submissive, feminine role. He would paint his face, adorn himself in gowns, and refer to his lovers as his husbands. This was more than just a sexual preference. In his syncretic worldview, it was a religious performance. As the high priest, he was the symbolic bride of his god. On earth, he would embody that role, taking strong, masculine men as his consorts, just as a goddess would. The stories began to trickle out from the palace, each more shocking than the last. He was said to wander the palace halls at night, offering himself to the guards. He allegedly set up a brothel within the imperial residence, where he would stand naked in a doorway, wiggling his hips and calling out to passers-by in a breathy voice, soliciting customers and boasting about his earnings to his fellow prostitutes. To the Romans, this was the ultimate degradation. Their emperor, the living embodiment of Roman power and dignity, was acting not just as a woman, but as the lowest kind of woman. Whether these stories were entirely true or exaggerated by his enemies was irrelevant. They were believable because they fit the pattern of a ruler who seemed determined to invert every Roman value. His first formal marriage was to a noblewoman, Cornelia Paula, a union likely engineered by his grandmother to create a veneer of respectability. It was a lavish affair, but it did not last. Elagabalus soon divorced her, claiming she had a blemish on her body. His next act was an unparalleled outrage. He married Aquilia Severa, a Vestal Virgin. The Vestals were the Sacred Heart of Rome. They swore a 30-year vow of chastity. To break it was a capital crime, punishable by being buried alive. For the emperor himself to violate this holiest of taboos was unthinkable. Elagabalus, however, had a perverse logic. He announced the union as a sacred marriage between himself, the high priest, and a high priestess. "It is fitting," he declared, "that a priest should marry a priestess so that divine children may be born." The city was aghast. This was not just an insult to tradition. It was a direct challenge to the gods of Rome, an act so profane it risked bringing down divine wrath upon the entire empire. Julia Maesa, the architect of his rise, watched with growing horror. She had wanted a pliable puppet who would restore her family's dynasty. Instead, she had unleashed a religious fanatic whose every action was eroding the very power she had schemed to win. The marble city was now home to a black stone and a boy god who answered to no authority but his own desires and his own deity. The Romans were trapped, watching their world be turned upside down. They began to pray, not to Elagabalus, but for a deliverance, no matter how bloody. Amidst the swirling chaos of his religious revolution, Elagabalus found a different kind of devotion, one that would come to define the carnal scandals of his reign. It was a love or an obsession that was as public and provocative as his worship of the black stone. Its object was a man named Hierocles. Hierocles was not a senator, a philosopher, or a general. He was a Carian slave, a charioteer whose fame was confined to the dusty tracks of the Circus Maximus. He was known for his skill with the reins and, more notably, for his striking blonde hair and athletic physique. He was the epitome of a certain kind of rugged, masculine beauty that the emperor found irresistible. Their meeting, according to the chroniclers, was pure spectacle. During a chariot race, Hierocles was thrown from his chariot in a dramatic crash directly in front of the imperial box. As he fell, his helmet was knocked off, revealing a cascade of golden hair. Elagabalus, looking down from his cushioned seat, was instantly captivated. He saw not a bleeding, defeated driver, but an Adonis delivered to him by fate. He ordered the injured charioteer be brought immediately to the palace. From that moment on, Hierocles' life was transformed. He was no longer a slave, he was the emperor's favorite. Elagabalus doted on him with an intensity that shocked the court. He showered him with wealth and honors, but it was the nature of their relationship that caused the deepest scandal. Elagabalus did not treat Hierocles as a mere favorite or a boy toy. He called him his husband. He reveled in being called Hierocles' wife, his queen, his mistress. In the private chambers of the palace, and often in full view of stunned courtiers, he would submit to Hierocles' authority. He delighted in being publicly beaten by his lover, wearing the bruises like jewelry, boasting that his husband was a real man with an uncontrollable passion for his wife. This inversion of roles was a profound violation of Roman ethics. An emperor was supposed to be the ultimate dominant figure, the paterfamilias of the entire state. For him to publicly and joyfully assume the role of a submissive wife to a former slave was an act of political and social suicide. It was seen as an abdication of his very right to rule. "Call me not Lord," he would insist to those who addressed him with the proper respect, "for I am a lady." He would then turn to Hierocles, a faint, painted smile on his lips. "And this is my lord, my emperor." Hierocles, for his part, seemed to have been a man of simple ambitions thrust into a world of terrifying complexity. He was not a cunning political operator, but he quickly grew accustomed to his new power. He became arrogant, treating the highest officials of the state with contempt. He knew his influence rested entirely on the emperor's infatuation, and he guarded it jealously. He had the emperor's ear, and by extension, he held the fate of powerful men in his hands. A word from Hierocles could see a senator disgraced or a general recalled. The government of the Roman Empire was effectively being run from the emperor's bedroom, and its chief minister was a charioteer. The emperor's desire to formalize this relationship knew no bounds. He openly wished that Hierocles could be officially declared his Caesar and successor. This was the breaking point for many, including his own family. The idea of a Carian slave, a man famous only for his looks and his role in the emperor's bed, being named heir to the Roman Empire was a madness they could not countenance. Julia Maesa, ever the pragmatist, was frantic. She pleaded with her grandson, "You are the emperor. He is a slave. This is not how the world works. You are destroying everything." Elagabalus would simply gaze at her, his dark eyes uncomprehending. "But I love him, grandmother," he would say, as if it were the simplest, most obvious thing in the world. "He is strong and beautiful. Is that not what a god-king deserves in a consort?" His devotion to Hierocles was not just a private affair. It was a public performance. He held a formal wedding ceremony, where he, the emperor, was the bride, veiled and blushing. The city was forced to celebrate the union. It was a grotesque parody of a sacred rite, and the populace seethed with a quiet, dangerous fury. The relationship was, by all accounts, volatile. Their passion was matched by furious arguments. Hierocles, fearing the emperor's fickle nature, often flew into rages, striking the boy who ruled the world. Elagabalus would weep and plead, and then proudly show off the marks of his husband's temper. "See how he loves me," he would exclaim. This period marked the high point of his personal indulgence and his political alienation. While Hierocles ruled the palace, the administration of the empire drifted. The legions on the frontiers grew restless. The economy faltered. The people of Rome, facing food shortages and political instability, looked to the Palatine Hill and saw a boy playing house with a charioteer while the world burned. The emperor sought to share not just his bed and his power with Hierocles, but also his most intimate physical transformations. It was during this time that he allegedly summoned the best physicians in the empire with a shocking request. He offered a fortune to any surgeon who could successfully equip him with female genitalia. He wanted to be a woman in body as well as in spirit, to be the perfect bride for his husband. The physicians, horrified and terrified in equal measure, could only stammer that such a thing was impossible. The request, which spread like wildfire through the city, cemented his reputation as a madman who sought to defy not just tradition, but nature itself. Hierocles, the blonde charioteer, had become the living symbol of the emperor's depravity. He was the emperor's husband, a title that was both a term of endearment within the palace walls and a curse on the lips of every Roman citizen. His existence was an affront, a daily reminder that their emperor had abandoned his duty, his dignity, and his sanity for the love of a man. The resentment against Hierocles was immense, but it was only a shadow of the hatred that was building against the master who had elevated him. With his god installed and his husband by his side, Elagabalus descended further into a world of his own creation, a court governed by aesthetics, desire, and a relentless pursuit of sensation. The palace on the Palatine became a theater of excess, where every Roman virtue was systematically mocked and every taboo gleefully violated. The stories that emanated from this court, whether wholly factual or the product of feverish rumor, painted a picture of an empire whose moral compass had shattered. One of the most persistent and damaging accounts was of the emperor's council of vice. Elagabalus, it was said, grew tired of the dour, gray-bearded senators who spoke of finances and frontier wars. He decided to create a new advisory body, a council whose members were chosen not for their wisdom or experience, but for a single, shocking qualification: the size of their genitalia. Agents were dispatched throughout the empire, from the bathhouses of Rome to the gymnasia of Greece, with instructions to measure and recruit men who were exceptionally well endowed. These men were brought to the palace, given titles, and asked to advise the emperor on matters of pleasure. The story, as recorded by the hostile Historia Augusta, was a potent piece of propaganda. It depicted the emperor not merely as indulgent, but as a man who had replaced the entire apparatus of Roman governance with a cabal of studs, reducing the state to an instrument of his lust. This obsession with masculine anatomy was a recurring theme. The emperor appointed a man named Aurelius Zodicus to the powerful position of cubicularius, or chamberlain, a role of immense intimacy and influence. Zodicus was an athlete from Smyrna, a man of staggering physique and reputed beauty. His only qualification was his fame as a lover. Elagabalus had heard tales of his prowess and had him brought to Rome in a grand procession, as if he were a visiting king. The arrival of Zodicus ignited a fierce jealousy in Hierocles. The palace was now home to a toxic love triangle. Hierocles, the husband, saw Zodicus as a mortal threat to his position. Elagabalus, for his part, seemed to revel in the drama, lavishing affection on his new favorite while trying to placate his old one. The first night Zodicus was to spend with the emperor became the stuff of legend. Elagabalus, painted and perfumed, awaited him with giddy anticipation. But Hierocles, fearing he was about to be replaced, took action. He bribed the imperial cupbearer to serve Zodicus a drugged drink. The potion did not kill the athlete, but it rendered him impotent. When Zodicus was brought before the emperor, he was unable to perform. In a fit of rage and disappointment, Elagabalus, feeling mocked and cheated, had the athlete stripped of his titles, flogged, and banished from Italy on the spot. The incident served as a stark warning. To fail the emperor in his pursuit of pleasure was a crime more serious than treason. The emperor's banquets became legendary for their profligate waste and cruel humor. He would serve his guests meals made entirely of one ingredient, 600 ostrich brains, or dishes of peas with gold leaf, lentils with onyx, and beans with amber. The food was often more for show than for consumption. His favorite party game was a perverse form of lottery. He would have wooden balls dropped from the ceiling onto his guests. Each ball contained a slip of paper describing a prize. The prizes ranged from the magnificent, 10 pounds of gold, a stable of horses, a country villa, to the bizarre and terrifying. One guest might win a dozen slaves, while the man next to him would win 10 pounds of dead flies, a dozen frogs, or, in one infamous case, the obligation to be host to a live bear in his bedroom. The emperor would watch, clapping with delight, as his guests scrambled for the balls, their faces a mixture of greed and terror. He took pleasure in deflating the pomposity of the aristocracy. He would invite the noblest men of the city to dinner, only to seat them on inflatable cushions that would be secretly deflated during the meal, sending the dignified guests tumbling to the floor. He would have tame lions and leopards, their claws and teeth removed, wander into the dining room while his guests were drunk, enjoying their panicked shrieks as they sobered up instantly. These acts, while seemingly childish pranks, had a corrosive effect. They demonstrated a profound contempt for the Roman elite. He was not just ignoring them, he was actively humiliating them, treating them like props in his personal circus. His pursuit of carnal experience allegedly led him to the city's darkest corners. Not content with the lovers he could summon to the palace, he was said to disguise himself and frequent the city's taverns and brothels. There, he would not just observe, but participate, selling his body to mule drivers and gladiators, arguing with the other prostitutes over customers and prices. The historian Cassius Dio, a contemporary senator, wrote with undisguised horror of the emperor setting aside a room in the palace and prostituting himself from it, hissing at clients from behind a curtain. These stories, a blend of fact and enemy propaganda, created an image of an emperor who had dissolved the boundary between the sacred and the profane, the public and the private, the ruler and the ruled. He was not just a sinner, he was a source of pollution. In the Roman mind, the well-being of the state, the residential publica, was intrinsically linked to the moral character, mos maiorum, and dignity, dignitas of its leaders. Elagabalus, by prostituting his body, was prostituting the very idea of the Roman Empire. Julia Maesa watched this all unfold with the cold dread of a master chess player who sees her king deliberately marching into checkmate. She had miscalculated catastrophically. The boy's exoticism, which she had thought would be a useful tool, had proven to be a consuming fire. He was not just eccentric. He was, in her eyes and the eyes of all Rome, uncontrollable. His court of carnal excess was not just a private indulgence. It was a public spectacle that was delegitimizing the Syrian dynasty she had fought so hard to restore. She realized that Elagabalus could not be saved. He had to be replaced, and she had another grandson waiting in the wings. While Elagabalus was transforming the palace into a shrine of hedonism, his grandmother, Julia Maesa, was making a chillingly pragmatic calculation. Her grandson was a disaster. His religious fanaticism, his sexual scandals, and his utter contempt for Roman tradition had made him universally hated. The loyalty of the Praetorian Guard, the ultimate arbiters of an emperor's fate, was wearing dangerously thin. Maesa knew that if Elagabalus fell, he would take the entire family with him, unless she could provide a viable alternative. That alternative was his cousin, Marcus Julius Gessius Bassianus Alexianus, known to history as Alexander Severus. He was the son of Maesa's other daughter, Julia Maesa. In every way, Alexander was the anti-Elagabalus. Where Elagabalus was flamboyant, Alexander was reserved. Where Elagabalus was impulsive and emotional, Alexander was sober and studious. He was a model Roman youth, respectful of his elders, interested in law and military matters, and content to live a life of quiet dignity. His mother, the stern and ambitious Maesa, had carefully curated this image, keeping him far from the debaucheries of the emperor's court. Maesa began her campaign subtly. She persuaded Elagabalus that he, as the high priest of the sun, should not be burdened with the tedious, earthly matters of state. He should devote himself entirely to his spiritual duties. To handle the mundane world of politics and law, he should adopt his virtuous cousin Alexander as his son and Caesar. Elagabalus, in a moment of rare political naivete, agreed. Perhaps he saw it as a way to mollify his grandmother and the Senate. Perhaps he genuinely believed it would free him to focus on his God and his pleasures. In 221 AD, the adoption was made official. The quiet, respectable Alexander Severus was now the heir to the throne. At first, Elagabalus seemed to enjoy the arrangement. He had a son to add to his bizarre imperial family. But he soon realized his mistake. The contrast between the two boys was stark, and it did not favor the emperor. The soldiers of the Praetorian Guard, men who valued discipline and traditional masculinity, began to show a marked preference for Alexander. They saw in him a return to normalcy, a future emperor they could respect. Senators and officials, weary of being ignored or humiliated, began to flock to the young Caesar, paying him the court that was due to the emperor. Elagabalus watched this shift with a growing, paranoid jealousy. The affection he had once commanded was now being redirected to his cousin. He saw the whispers in the corridors, the respectful nods given to Alexander, the averted eyes when he himself passed by in his silks and cosmetics. He realized he had not gained a helper. He had created a rival. His jealousy soon curdled into murderous intent. He began to regret the adoption and declared it void. He put out a rumor that Alexander was gravely ill, hoping to test the reaction of the guard. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. The Praetorians mutinied, refusing to perform their duties until they saw Alexander Severus, alive and well, in their camp. Trembling with fear, Elagabalus was forced to comply. In a scene of ultimate humiliation, he had to take Alexander in his own imperial chariot and ride to the Praetorian camp. The emperor and his heir, side by side, one the object of the soldiers' adoration, the other the object of their contempt. The soldiers cheered wildly for Alexander. For Elagabalus, there was only a stony, menacing silence. This event sealed his fate in his own mind. Alexander had to die. He began to plot, but his attempts were clumsy and transparent. He ordered Alexander's assassination several times, but the boy was protected by his mother, Mamaea, and, more importantly, by the Praetorians themselves, who now saw themselves as Alexander's personal bodyguards. Each failed attempt only deepened their hatred for Elagabalus and their loyalty to his cousin. The emperor grew more erratic. He lashed out, dismissing senators and officials he suspected of favoring Alexander. He tried to reassert his authority through his religion, demanding ever more elaborate and bizarre ceremonies. He even tried to command the Praetorians to execute soldiers whose loyalty to Alexander he questioned. They refused. An emperor who could not command his own guards was an emperor in name only. The final days were thick with tension. The palace was divided into two armed camps. Elagabalus, surrounded by his husband Hierocles, his mother Soaemias, and his coterie of favorites, was isolated on one side. On the other was Alexander, shielded by his mother Mamaea and the tacit support of the Praetorian Guard. Julia Maesa, the Grand Matriarch, the woman who had set this all in motion, made her final move. She had created Elagabalus, and now she would sanction his destruction. She gave her quiet approval to the Praetorians. The message was clear: remove the liability, and the dynasty will be secured under Alexander. On March 11th, 222 AD, the storm finally broke. A dispute, likely orchestrated, erupted between guards loyal to Elagabalus and those supporting Alexander. Elagabalus, in a panic, ordered the arrest of the soldiers he deemed disloyal. It was the spark the Praetorians had been waiting for. They stormed the palace not as guards, but as an execution squad. Their target was no longer just the emperor's favorites. It was the emperor himself. The shadow of Alexander had finally eclipsed the sun. The end was not swift or merciful. It was as squalid and humiliating as his enemies could make it. When the Praetorians stormed the palace, their bloodlust was absolute. Their first targets were the symbols of the emperor's reign. They hunted down Hierocles, the charioteer who had dared to call himself the emperor's husband. They found him and cut him to pieces. They seized the other favorites, the Council of Studs, the sycophants who had prospered under the boy god's rule, and slaughtered them without trial. The marble floors of the palace, so often witness to bizarre rites and decadent parties, ran red with the blood of the emperor's men. Elagabalus, hearing the screams and the clash of steel, knew his time was over. Terror stripped him of his divine pretensions. He was once again a 17-year-old boy, desperate to live. He and his mother, Julia Soaemias, who had indulged his every whim and now faced the consequences alongside him, ran through the palace gardens, seeking a place to hide. Their final, pathetic refuge was a latrine. The Emperor of the Sun, the High Priest of Elagabalus, the self-proclaimed living god, was found cowering in a toilet, clinging to his mother. The soldiers showed no pity. They dragged them out, their fine silk robes stained with filth. Soaemias, trying to shield her son with her body, was struck down first. Elagabalus watched his mother die before the soldiers turned on him. He was stabbed repeatedly, his life bleeding out onto the cold stone floor of the privy. But death was not enough for the enraged soldiers. They wanted to erase the very memory of his reign. They tied ropes to the bodies of the emperor and his mother and began to drag them through the streets of Rome. The citizens, who had watched his reign with a mixture of fear and disgust, poured out to watch the spectacle. They cheered and jeered, throwing stones and refuse at the mutilated corpses. This was their revenge for the violated gods, the tarnished dignity of the empire, the hunger and the humiliation. They dragged the bodies to the Tiber River, the traditional dumping ground for criminals and tyrants. They tried to stuff Elagabalus's body into a sewer drain, but it wouldn't fit. In a final act of desecration, they tied weights to the corpses and hurled them from the Aemilian Bridge into the murky water, so that they might never receive a proper burial. With Elagabalus dead, the Senate, which had lived in fear of him, enacted the most severe punishment available to them: damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory. His name was to be chiseled off every inscription, every monument. His statues were to be torn down. His laws were nullified. It was to be as if he had never existed. The black stone of Emesa was unceremoniously shipped back to Syria. The Elagabalus was rededicated to Jupiter. The old gods were restored to their rightful places. Alexander Severus, the quiet boy who had been his cousin's shadow, was proclaimed emperor. Under the steady, controlling hands of his mother, Julia Maesa, and his grandmother, Julia Maesa, a semblance of order and tradition was restored. Rome breathed a collective sigh of relief. So ended the strange, spectacular, and sordid reign of Elagabalus. He ruled for less than 4 years, a brief, fiery comet across the Roman sky. But what is his true legacy? Was he, as the ancient historians and his enemies insisted, the most depraved man in Roman history? A monster of unrestrained lust and madness? Or was he something more complex? A boy crushed by the impossible weight of a power he never sought and did not understand? A religious visionary whose ecstatic, syncretic faith was simply incomprehensible to the rigid, legalistic mind of Rome? A teenager from a different culture, thrust into a position where every personal quirk became a political crime? Perhaps he was one of the ancient world's most profound examples of a figure who defied gender and sexual norms. In an empire built on the ideal of masculine virtus, he was a ruler who publicly embraced what his culture deemed feminine. He rejected the role of the dominant male and reveled in being the submissive wife. This, more than the sex itself, may have been his greatest transgression. It wasn't that he slept with men. It was that he wanted to be the woman. It was a challenge to the very structure of Roman identity, and for that, he could not be forgiven. The story of Elagabalus is a cautionary tale, written by the victors. They painted him as a one-dimensional villain, a caricature of Oriental decadence. But behind the lurid tales of prostitution, outlandish banquets, and scandalous loves lies the ghost of a boy who tried to make the largest empire on earth dance to the frantic, ecstatic rhythm of a Syrian drum. The empire refused to learn the steps, and in the end, it trampled him underfoot, throwing his body in the river and his name to the eternal curse of history. He remains forever frozen in our imagination. The painted boy god, the emperor of the sun, whose strange carnal pleasures became the ultimate symbol of a Rome that had lost its way. Thank you for watching Silent Atrocities. Hit the like button, subscribe, and ring that bell for more stories that the headlines don't tell.